Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here to give you my review of the Sony 16mm F1.8, and this is from their G series. Now, Sony's 20mm F1.8 G lens had the misfortune of releasing just about the time that the pandemic was picking up across the globe. And so in some ways, I think it maybe didn't get as much attention as it might have under different circumstances. But even still today in 2025, I think it remains one of Sony's hidden gems, a really excellent lens. Sony has built on that formula by going even wider from 20mm to 16mm, even smaller and about $100 cheaper. And while the Sony FE 16mm f1.8 does have one significant optical flaw that I will highlight in this review, it is otherwise a really fantastic lens. So we're going to explore why this $800 wide-angle prime probably should be at the top of your list if you're looking for a wide-angle prime in today's review. It's very interesting. I actually got two Sony lenses at the same time for review. One of them was this lens, the other was the 400 to 800mm G lens. And as you can see there, at two extremes of Sony's design spectrum. But a probably more likely comparison is going to be this lens, which is Viltrox's Autofocus 16mm f1.8. It's obviously a very natural competitor, same focal length, same maximum aperture, and really the price is not radically different, about $250 between the two. And yes, for those of you that are so interested, I will do a full comparison video where I break everything down side by side of these two lenses. Watch for that, it will be upcoming. But what is one thing that's really interesting to me that quickly stood out to me as I started to do side-by-side tests is that while they're both 16mm lenses, the Sony's actually significantly wider than what the Viltrox is. Now, there's maybe a little bit of give and take with that I'll explore here in just a moment, but it is wider. It is 107 degrees versus 105.6 degrees. Now, the one thing that's you probably already noticed is that the Sony lens manages to be much smaller than what the Viltrox does. It is only 73.8 millimeters in diameter by 75 millimeters in length, or 2.91 by 3 inches. It weighs in at just 304 grams or 10.7 ounces, which means that it is a full 246 grams less than what the Viltrox is. Getting pretty close to half the weight, which is really quite impressive that it is so small and so lightweight. Up front, we've got 67mm filter threads, and you may not be able to see it, but also on that front element is a flooring coating, and then throughout the lens to the actual mount, there are 10 different weather sealing gaskets, as you can see here around all the switches and all of the rings, and so it is a thoroughly weather sealed lens. It also has a very thorough and robust feature set despite being so small. We've got Sony's full complement of approach to aperture here, and so that starts, you can have it clicked, and the clicking is definitely on the firm side, and so when you switch into the declick mode, it's surprising how little resistance there is there. They've also got an iris lock that will allow you to either lock into or out of that manual aperture ring if you want to make sure you don't go into automatic, or if you're someone who doesn't like an aperture ring, you have the option to lock right out of it altogether. Now, on the declicked side, I did note, I find some lenses, some cheaper lenses, even if they have a declick option, you still see very visible steps as you go throughout the aperture, so it doesn't really work for aperture racking very smoothly. It's not the case here, and as you can see, I was able to do a pretty smooth aperture rack without any kind of issue, and so kudos to them for making sure that this actually works, and so it's not kind of just a wasted feature. Now, one thing you may also have noticed in that test is that there are 11 rounded aperture blades, and they do really a very good job of maintaining nice circular shape to the specular highlights. And we are actually able to get a little bit bigger highlights than what you might expect from a 16mm lens, for the simple reason that this lens can actually focus down very closely. If you're using autofocus, you can focus as closely as 15 centimeters. However, if you manually focus, you can actually move 2 centimeters closer, up to 13 centimeters. And so your maximum magnification is 0.25 if you're using autofocus, but all the way up to 0.3 0.30 times if you're using that manual focus to get a little closer. Now, downside of that is, as you can see here, this is how close I had to be to this chess piece to produce this image right here. And so obviously you're going to have to get really, really close to your subject. You're almost certainly going to need to remove the lens hood to avoid shading it or interfering with your subject. And if you're happening to shoot a two-dimensional subject, as you can see here, like from my test chart, the plane of focus is anything but flat. It almost seems three-dimensional as you look at this image here. Now, Sony's able to achieve that close focus capabilities by putting some floating elements in the design. So just so you know, with floating elements, if you have the lens off like this and you rock it back and forth, you'll feel a little bit of a clunk as if things are moving back and forth inside. That's because they are. Your lens isn't broken, but it has those floating elements. But you can know that nothing is wrong because if you mount it to the camera and you turn the camera on, you can do that same thing and nothing is moving because now those elements are energized. It is a purposeful part of the design, and it's what allows it to work so well up close. The manual focus ring moves very smoothly. It's on the light side. However, the focus motors are nice and quick, and so there's no lag, and so you do have a good overall focus experience. As noted, there is a lens hood. It's shallow. It locks into, there's no lock, but it bayonets into place with a good definite click. And so it holds into place nicely, no issues there. It's shallow enough that it shouldn't interfere with using filters up front and rotating them. So obviously this is a very well executed package, very feature rich and extremely compact. I love a compact lens like this because it just means it's far more likely it's going to make it into my bag and come along with me when I travel. So how about the autofocus? Sony is doing probably a better job than any company I'm aware of in really nailing autofocus at this point. And that is that they don't really skimp on using their focus motor. So here, even though this is a wide lens, we have two of their XD linear motors, high-powered linear motors that are driving autofocus. And so that means that if anything, the focus system is overpowered here. And so focus is extremely fast, extremely quiet. And as you can see, whether we're shooting indoors or outdoors, it just basically zips back and forth. And so no issues with that. And so it does a great job indoors or outdoors. And what's more, because it's a native Sony lens, you also get the advantage of being able to unleash the full burst capacity of your camera. And so when I'm shooting on a camera like my Alpha 1, that means I'm getting up to 30 frames per second. If you're shooting on something like the A9 Mark III, that could be all the way up to 120 frames per second. Whereas with a third-party lens, you simply can't do that because of an artificially imposed limitation from Sony. And so great to be able to have that full capability. You can also see here that eye tracking, it works quite well, but just understand that that's only going to work when you're at close focus distances because the eye becomes too small in the frame with a wide angle lens to track that. And so it will switch from the eye to the face. And after a while, it'll switch to the body, which is all fine because everything is going to be in focus at that point anyway. So for stills, I had zero issues with autofocus. It worked really, really well. So how about the video side of things? Again, this lens has got plenty of power, and so you would expect that it performs well, and that's exactly what it does. Focus pulls are fast and they're smooth, no issues there. There's no visible steps. There's no pauses or hesitations. What's more, you can see that focus breathing is fairly minimal, and so it's not going to be any kind of issue. And of course, because it's a Sony lens, you will have the advantage of Sony's focus breathing compensation to further smooth things out if your camera is so equipped. I found with my hand test that it was mostly good. There was a few times where it stuck on my face rather than transitioning to my hand, but frankly, I blame that more on the fact that because of being such a wide angle, even putting my hand forward, a lot of times a little bit of my face is left unblocked, and so I think it stayed locked on that. But again, when it does transition back and forth, those focus transitions are really nice and smooth, and so and I think fairly cinematic, and so I don't see any kind of real issue there. Now in this clip, I had Nala kind of move towards me, and what I found is that focus was moving along with her. However, it's not nailing on her eye all the time. I think you would have to turn up focus speed. Right now, it's detuned a little bit to allow it to be a little bit more cinematic. If you're wanting to track persistent action, I would turn up the reactiveness a little bit more in camera, and so I'm getting get that kind of focus point from like her shoulder or neck level up to the eye level where it's keeping up there. But I think I see enough there to understand that this lens is going to do fine, even if you're tracking things that are coming towards the camera itself. We'll take a look now at the image quality, and I will have my deep dive optical breakdown at the end of the video for those of you interested in that. This is an optical design of 15 elements in 12 groups. By the way, that's identical to what the Viltrox's design is. Sony's design here has 7 different exotic elements, different kinds of aspherical elements, different kinds of extreme low dispersion elements of different varieties that are in there. You can see that the MTF, it looks really excellent, and there's the vast majority of the performance all across the frame is above the 80% margin, and in some cases highly above that. In fact, if I did do this comparison chart between the Sony and the excellent Viltrox lens, you can just see how much better the Sony lens is. There's just a lot more above that 80% threshold than what there is on the Viltrox. However, this lens does have one fairly huge optical flaw, and that is that it has a massive amount of barrel distortion. And part of the reason why I think it's a little extra wide is that there's extra that's left there to give room for correction. And so that's just a factor that has to be taken into consideration. It requires a +30 to correct for the barrel distortion. And as you can see, if I'm manually correcting, it doesn't correct all that well. It's still quite a complex mustache style pattern there. In fact, if looking at this, there's more distortion left after correction than what there is before correction on the Viltrox. And so this is an area where the Sony is just way behind the Viltrox. This is obviously the place where Sony's engineers compromised to allow us to get such a small package there. Now, if you look at the JPEG of that, which has the in-camera corrections on, you can see that it does a fairly good job of correcting for it. And if I look at this kind of real-world comparison with some walls, you can see with the uncorrected RAW, it looks terrible. The corrected JPEG, it looks good enough that I suspect people won't notice. And so I wouldn't even rule out this lens for doing real estate type work. I think as long as you're getting the correction, it looks okay. There's probably better choices, but I think I can make do with it in a pinch if necessary. Fortunately, everything else is quite good. Vignette is to the low to moderate side, particularly for a wide-angle compact lens. I used a +52 to correct for it, but I didn't really notice it being much of an issue even in uncorrected images. And by the way, that's an area that it definitely excels over the Viltrox. The Viltrox has about double amount of vignette there. I also found that while there isn't a complete lack of longitudinal chromatic aberrations, they're very minor, and obviously with wide-angle lenses, there's not really a lot of real-world situations where you end up with that kind of fringing. Anyway, far more common is the lateral style chromatic aberrations that come near the edges of the frame, and this lens handles that like a champ. And either on my test chart or out in real world results, I saw no fringing there, and so contrast and detail right off into the corners is looking really quite excellent. Speaking of that sharpness, this lens is fantastically sharp, particularly in the center and the mid frame. And as you can see here, even at f1.8, contrast and detail is fabulous in the center of the frame. Mid frame looks excellent. And there's just a little bit of fall off into the corners. And I think a lot of that has to do with the amount of correction that's needed there in the corner. However, if you start to stop down a little bit by f2.8, the corners are looking quite good, and they're excellent from f4 to f8, kind of your prime landscape apertures. They look really fantastic. I found that real world detail and contrast just looks amazing, and definitely comparing side by side, I would say that the contrast is a little bit better on the Sony lens than what it does on the Viltrox. Viltrox is a great lens, but the Sony lens is better still in those metrics. Diffraction is going to start to creep in at f11. Still looks okay there, but by f16 and then particular f22, which is the minimum aperture, you can see that diffraction has really softened the image. Now, because you can get so close to your subject, you will be able to create some defocused background. The bokeh is okay. It's not like particularly creamy or anything like that. It can be a little bit busy in certain situations. Specular highlights mostly look okay, though they do have a little bit of concentric rings inside of them, and will have a little bit of deformation into the corners. Overall, however, it looks pretty good. And again, I appreciate the fact that you can get close to your subjects and gives you just some more creative options for composing out there. Flare resistance overall is quite good. There's very good contrast. There is some mild ghosting. I actually noticed it less at wide open or small apertures and more in the middle of the range at 5.6, f6.3. You see a little bit more of a ghosting pattern here, but overall it looks pretty good. Sun stars I find look nice. You get a 22 pointed star and they have pretty nice definition. Certainly could add to an image. And then finally I tested for shooting coma, and there is some coma astigmatism in the corners where those star points starting to look a little bit like flying insects. It's not terrible, but it's not great either. The Viltrox is a hair better in that regard, but of course the Viltrox also has much more vignette, which means that towards the corners of the frame you have a different issue to have to correct for. And so it wouldn't be my top choice for shooting astro, but certainly it works, and it's anything but terrible for that. So overall, outside of that barrel distortion, optics are really quite good, despite it being so compact here. So my conclusion is this. I feel like an f1.8 lens, to me, for wide angle, kind of hits the sweet spot. Sure, there are f1.4 options out there, but they tend to be much, much larger, weigh a lot more, cost a lot more. I love that we can get this compact a package and really get a very decently bright aperture. And of course, it's much easier to get hand-holdable shutter speeds with a wide-angle lens than what it is with a longer lens anyway. So I feel even then that the bright aperture is a little bit less necessary. And so to me, f1.8 is bright enough, and it allows you to continue to have, as we've seen, great optical performance, but also this wonderfully compact package. I mean, this is a lens that easily fits into the palm of your hand, easy to throw into a bag, easy to bring along, no issues there. At $800, it's not cheap per se, but the fact that it is $100 cheaper than the 20mm f1.8, after all of the inflation since that lens has been released, tells me that Sony's actually being very competitive with the pricing here. And so $800 for what is an extremely good lens outside of that barrel distortion, I think makes it a pretty fair value. And again, it's not radically more expensive than what the Viltrox is, which is really the only other main competitor that's out there. This is a lens with great autofocus, a great feature set. It's wonderfully compact. It's extremely sharp. And so all of that adds up to a lens I think that is well worth consideration. Now, if you want more information, you can check out my full text review that's linked in the description down below. There's buying links there also, and we're getting close to those pre-orders starting to be fulfilled at this point. And of course, if you want a deeper dive into the optical performance, stay tuned with me right now. We'll jump into that together. Okay, we're going to start by getting the bad news out of the way. So we're going to, like a Band-Aid, we're just going to rip it off quick here. There is a really tremendous amount of barrel distortion. And so you can see here looking at this, there's a considerable amount of leftover image that's there. That's not because I framed with that additional, but rather I was framing with these basically right inside. I used these outside lines as my framing guide. And so that was how I was lined up, and there's a lot left over. And that's to allow for electronic correction. Now, I've only seen Canon really do more than this, but this is bad. I mean, this is a massive amount of distortion. And as you can see, it's a very complex pattern. I tried to manually correct it as good as I could. There is no raw profile available for Lightroom yet. So, but I always do this anyway. So I wanted to see how it would correct. And as you can see, it's just a really wavy pattern that's left behind. Now, by the numbers, this is a plus 30 to correct for the distortion. Vignette, far less of an issue. Vignette, I used a plus 52 to correct for. It's not bad. Now, while there isn't a raw profile yet available, I've taken this JPEG out of camera, so it'll give you an idea on how well it's all going to correct. You can see it's not flawless. It's a little too complex to be corrected flawlessly, but it's not bad either, and so certainly usable. And I think that's illustrated here. If we look at the raw image, you can see there's just lots of bowed areas where that barrel distortion is affecting the image. If we look on the right, this is the JPEG out of camera. You can see how much of the image has been taken away for correction if you compare side by side. Remember, this is the exact same image taken at the exact same time. But that being said, you can see that the lines for kind of a real-world shot like this, they all look fine. I mean, I don't see anything that's kind of standing out to me as being objectionable. Obviously, that's really going to help this lens to continue to be useful for a lot of these applications, thanks to getting great electronic support from Sony. Now, beyond that, it is mostly good news. Yes, there is a little bit of this green fringing, some longitudinal style chromatic aberration, but with a wide-angle lens like this, there are going to be relatively few situations where you would ever see what little is there. And more important would be the lateral chromatic aberrations near the edge of the frame, and they are not quite perfectly, but pretty close to perfectly corrected, very clean black to white transitions. So that means if we go out into the real world and we look off into the edge of this image, where typically in all, particularly these bare branches, that you would see the fringing on either side of them, it's just not there. And so what that means is that the lens is going to resolve really nicely right off to the very edge of the frame. Now, the MTF suggests that this is a very sharp lens, particularly in the center and mid frame. This is going to be 200% magnification. I'm going to show you on a 61 megapixel Sony a7R Mark V. So here at extremely high magnification on very high resolution, the center is pretty much perfect. Very, very precise rendering of all the fine details, good contrast. If we move into the mid frame, it also looks excellent, really, really strong. And as we kind of pan down here, we can see that as we get towards the corner, it does drop a little bit, and a lot of that's also too, you can see things are kind of dragged and stretched a little bit in trying to correct for the distortion. We can see a pretty similar result in the various areas of the frame, and so we have got a good centering performance here as well. Now, in real-world use, I felt like even at f1.8, the real-world contrast is really great, and so you can see a lot of pop here. Into all of these branches, just a lot of places for textures to be mushy. They're not. It's resolving really nicely. Obviously, at f1.8, depth of field means it's not going to be the same all the way throughout the image, but everything that falls in that plane of focus really looks quite excellent. Here's f1.8 and then f2.8, and so we see in the middle of the frame, it already looks great. Obviously, contrast improves a bit more as you stop down a little bit. If we pan over here to the side, you can see a little bit more noticeable a difference, just more that the contrast levels are a little bit deeper, but it already looked really good. And between f2.8 and f5.6, we can see that the details really just resolve even more so. So contrast becomes great right into the corners. Going back to f1.8 in a real-world image, you can see the amount of detail there is just really, really beautiful. Contrast looks great. And, of course, this being a first-party Sony lens with great autofocus, it means you're getting great results even when you're in kind of an extreme situation. And so, in this moment, this is f1.8, very fast action. You can't tell because it's a frozen shot, but he's moving very quickly here. But detail looks great there, well focused. Again, here a very precise moment, but detail looks really good because autofocus is helping the lens to achieve its potential. Going back to the test chart for a moment, f2.8 looks brilliant in the center of the frame, and f5.6 doesn't look a whole lot different, but you're going to see that difference more up here in the corners. And you can see that at f2.8 it looks good, but at f5.6 it looks great. Nor is it a paper tiger. If we take a big landscape image like this and we just poke around in the various details right off to the edge of the frame, you can see that there's just lots of information, a lot of textures that have been gathered. It looks really, really fantastic. This is an extremely sharp lens. You've probably heard me frequently say that I consider f11 to be pretty much the smallest aperture that I'm willing to go to when I'm using a high-resolution camera, and you can see the reasons why. By f11, it's not looking as good, but still looking very good. But by f22, the minimum aperture, you can see the image is just really, really much softer, and that's due to the effects of diffraction. So again, if at all possible, I would say go as small as f11 and don't go beyond that. So as mentioned previously, while you can get a very high degree of magnification, if you're working with a two-dimensional subject, the plane of focus is not fast at all. In fact, it looks like this ship is kind of sailing right off of the flat bill, and that's because there is so much field curvature here. So just be aware of that. It's actually going to work better with a three-dimensional object. You can see it's actually... the perspective is not great, but you're able to kind of use that as a point of emphasis, and so it's not as destructive. Here's the difference, just toggling back and forth between, this would be the autofocus result, this is the manual focus result. So you can get a little bit closer, you can get a slightly higher degree of magnification if you manually focus in.
Now, without being right on top of the lock, and you'd be surprised at how close I was, but not anywhere near the minimum focus distance. But you can see that the detail on the lock looks fantastic. The bokeh quality, I can only say that's okay. I don't consider that to be exceptional at all. Here, I'm right on top of the subject, near minimum focus distance. So the background is more strongly blurred out. It's better, but don't expect this lens to be like crushing backgrounds and making them really soft and creamy. That's not realistic. Flare resistance overall is good. So here's a pretty typical shot where the sun might be right out of frame. You can see contrast is holding up perfectly. Here, where a very bright directional sun is in the frame at f1.8, again, contrast is holding up very well. Just a very, very minor little ghosting artifact right there. Nothing bad. Here, stop down to f11. You can see that there's a little bit of a prismatic pattern from stopping down, but again, it's holding up really well. What's interesting here is that you might be able to see here in this image where I've composed to where it allows more of that to show up. There is a little bit of a ghosting pattern, but it's not strongly pronounced. In fact, I see it more stop down towards the middle of the range. This is f6.3. Now, maybe you don't mind that at all. I'm just pointing it out and so you can be aware of it. You will also see here, going back to f11 in this shot, that the sunbursts look to me really quite good. 22 pointed star from the 11 bladed aperture, and the blades have nice precision. I think that's going to add rather than distract from an image. Finally, taking a look here at coma. And so, the good news is that star points are nice and crisp here in the center of the frame. There's very low fringing, and so that doesn't mar the image. And you can see that as we get off into the corners, that's where we start to see that astigmatism. And so the stars start to look like they're taking wings and trying to fly out of the frame. But it's also not the worst that I've seen by far, and obviously because those star points occupy such a small portion of the frame, the general impression you're going to get, I think, is just good overall. So thanks for sticking through the optical breakdown. I hope it's helped you to make a more informed decision whether or not this is a lens for you. As always, thanks for watching, have a great day, and let the light in.